The letter arrived on a grey morning in Old Town, carried by a raven whose feathers still held the salt tang of the western sea. Master Wendell broke the citadel's seal with hands that had sutured 100 wounds and copied 1,000 texts, but had never trembled quite like this. The words were brief, as they always were when the news was unwelcome. He was to sail for Pyke within the fortnight. House Greyjoy required a master. The previous one had died, the letter said, though it did not specify how. On the Iron Islands, Wendell knew, there were many ways for a man to die. He stood in his chamber at the citadel for a long while after reading, watching the morning light crawl across his desk. His chains felt heavier than usual, each link a reminder of years spent in study, in service to knowledge and healing. Silver for medicine, gold for economics, iron for warcraft, pale steel for ravencraft. He had earned every one of them honestly, patiently, and now they would carry him to a place where such things were valued less than the strength of a man's sword arm and the salt in his blood. The senior archmaesters offered him no comfort when he sought counsel. The Iron Islands are part of the 7 kingdoms, one said, as though that settled the matter. Every lord requires a maester, even the Ironborn. The word carried a faint note of distaste, quickly masked. But Wendell heard it clearly enough. He was being sent into exile, though no one would call it that. This was duty. This was service. This was what he had sworn to do when he forged his chain. He packed his things carefully over the following days. Medical supplies, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth to protect against the damp. Books, though he suspected Pyke's library would be sparse at best. Parchment, ink, quills, the tools of his trade. His worldly possessions fit into 2 trunks and a leather satchel. A Maester travelled light, unencumbered by the vanities that weighed down lords and ladies. Still, as Wendell watched the servants load his belongings onto the wagon that would carry them to the docks, he felt the peculiar lightness of a man severing ties he had not known bound him so firmly. The ship that bore him westward was a trading vessel, its hold stuffed with grain and wool, bound for the ports of the Westerlands. The captain was a weathered man who spoke little, and seemed to view Wendell's presence with vague suspicion, as though masters were bad luck aboard a ship. Perhaps they were. Wendell spent most of the voyage in the small cabin they had given him, reading by candlelight and trying not to think about where he was going. When he did venture onto the deck, he watched the coastline slip past, green and gentle, and wondered how long it would be before he saw such country again. The Iron Islands announced themselves long before they came into view. The air changed, growing colder and heavy with brine. The gulls that followed the ship became fiercer, their cries sharper. The sailors grew quieter, more watchful. And then, on the morning of the 6th day, Wendell saw them. Dark shapes rising from grey water, all black cliffs and jagged rocks shrouded in mist. The Iron Islands. They looked, he thought, like the broken teeth of some ancient beast, jutting from the sea to bite at the sky. Pyke was the largest of them, though large was a generous word. As the ship drew closer, Wendell could make out the castle itself, if castle was the right term for such a structure. It wasn't one building, but many, scattered across a series of stone stacks and sea-carved pillars, connected by swaying rope bridges that looked as though they might give way at any moment. The keeps rose grey and austere against the greyer sky, with no banners flying, no bright colours to break the monotony of stone and sea. Everything here was the colour of iron, the colour of storm. Even the foam that crashed against the rocks below seemed dirty rather than white. The ship docked at Lordsport, a collection of timber buildings clustered around a small harbour. Wendell gathered his belongings and descended the gangplank on unsteady legs, grateful to be on solid land again, however unwelcoming that land might be. The dock smelled of fish and tar and something else, something he could not quite identify. Rotting kelp, perhaps, or simply age. Everything here seemed old, worn down by wind and salt and time. A man was waiting for him at the end of the dock. Ironborn, clearly, from the cut of his clothes and the hard set of his face. He wore a jerkin of boiled leather over a rough wool tunic, and his boots were crusted with salt. "You the Maester?" he asked, his voice flat. "I am," Wendell replied. "Maester Wendell, sent by the Citadel to serve House Greyjoy." The man grunted. "I'm to take you to the castle. Lord Balon will see you when he has time, or he won't. Depends on his mood." He turned and started walking without waiting for a response, forcing Wendell to hurry after him with his satchel clutched in one hand. They travelled by horse along a narrow road that hugged the coast. Wendell was not an accomplished rider, and the horse they had given him seemed to sense this, testing him with sudden stops and irritated snorts. The Ironborn guide said nothing, offering neither help nor mockery, simply riding ahead with the easy confidence of a man born to the saddle. The landscape around them was bleak. Scrubgrass clung to rocky soil, bent nearly flat by the constant wind. There were no trees to speak of, no farms, no signs of the plenty Wendell had known in the Reach and the Riverlands. This was a hard land, and it bred hard people. The castle itself was even more imposing up close. The rope bridges swayed in the wind, creaking and groaning, and Wendell felt his stomach turn at the thought of crossing them. But there was no other way. The guide led him across the first bridge without hesitation, boots thumping on the wooden slats, and Wendell followed because there was nothing else to do. He did not look down. He could hear the sea below, crashing and hissing, eager to claim him if he stumbled. They crossed 3 bridges before reaching the main keep, each one more terrifying than the last. By the time Wendell stepped onto solid stone again, his hands were shaking, and his palms were slick with sweat despite the cold. The guide noticed, but said nothing, which Wendell supposed was a small mercy. Inside the castle was dark and damp. The walls wept with moisture, and the torches that lit the corridors burned fitfully, their smoke adding to the gloom. The air tasted of salt and smoke and mildew. Wendell thought of the Citadel, with its high windows and clean sunlight, and felt a pang of loss so sharp it surprised him. "Your chambers," the guide said, stopping before a wooden door banded with iron. He pushed it open and gestured inside. "Lord Balon will send for you, or he won't." He turned and walked away, leaving Wendell standing in the doorway alone. The room was small and spare. A narrow bed, a desk, a single chair, a window that looked out onto grey sea and grey sky. There was a brazier in the corner, currently cold, and a shelf that held a few leather-bound volumes, so warped by damp that Wendell doubted they could still be read. He set his satchel down carefully and began to unpack, trying to make the space his own. It was a losing battle. The damp seemed to seep into everything, and the sound of the sea was constant, a low roar that never quite faded into background noise. He was examining the books on the shelf, trying to determine if any were salvageable, when he heard footsteps in the corridor. A servant appeared, a thin woman with grey hair and a face like carved driftwood. "Lord Balon will see you now, Maester," she said. "Follow me." Wendell followed her through the winding corridors of the keep, trying to memorize the path and failing. Everything looked the same in this place. Stone and shadow and the constant whisper of the sea. They descended a spiral stair, crossed another interior courtyard, open to the sky and the wind, and finally entered a hall that was larger than the others. Its walls hung with ancient tapestries that depicted longships and battles and drowning men. Balon Greyjoy sat in a chair of black driftwood at the far end of the hall. He was not a large man, but there was something unyielding about him, something that reminded Wendell of the cliffs outside, battered by waves, but never breaking. His face was lean and weathered, his hair grey and thin, his eyes dark and cold as the sea itself. He wore simple clothes, black and grey, with no gold or jewels. The only ornament he bore was a pin shaped like a golden kraken, fastened to his cloak. Standing beside him was a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, with the same dark eyes and hard expression. She wore men's clothing, leather and wool, and she watched Wendell with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. This, he realized, must be Asha Greyjoy, the Lord's daughter, or Yara, as she was called here. The Master's records had mentioned her, though the details were sparse. "My lord," Wendell said, bowing, "I am Maester Wendell, sent by the Citadel to serve House Greyjoy. I am at your command." Balon studied him in silence for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough as stone grinding on stone. "The Citadel sends me an old man." Wendell was not yet 40, but he supposed that by Ironborn standards, where men died young and violent, he might seem ancient. "I have served faithfully for 15 years, my lord. I am trained in the healing arts, in the care of ravens, in the maintenance of records and correspondence. I will serve House Greyjoy with the same dedication." "Healing arts," Balon repeated, and there was something like contempt in his voice. "We have our own ways here, Maester. The drowned god tests a man's strength. Those who are worthy live. Those who are not drown." He leaned back in his chair. "But you may tend to the ravens and the books, if it pleases you. The previous Maester kept them in poor order. Perhaps you'll do better." It was a dismissal, barely veiled. Wendell bowed again. "I will do my best, my lord." "See that you do," Balon said. "My daughter will show you to the rookery and the archives. What remains of them?" He waved a hand, and Yara stepped forward. She looked Wendell up and down with frank appraisal, and he had the distinct impression she found him wanting. "Come on then," she said. "I haven't got all day." He followed her from the hall, relieved to be out from under Balon's cold gaze. Yara walked quickly, her boots ringing on the stone, and Wendell had to hurry to keep pace. "Your father seems a hard man," he ventured. She glanced back at him, one eyebrow raised. "This is the Iron Islands, Maester. Hard is all we have." She led him up another stairway, this one narrow and winding. "The rookery is in the sea tower. The previous Maester didn't like climbing the stairs, said his knees were bad. He spent most of his time drunk in his chambers, from what I heard." They emerged into a round room at the top of the tower, open to the elements on one side, where the ravens could come and go. The birds stirred at their approach, rustling and muttering. Wendell counted perhaps 24 of them, far fewer than a castle of this importance should have. Many of the perches were empty. The smell was overpowering. the floor thick with droppings that had not been cleaned in what must have been months. "As you can see," Yara said dryly, "there is work to be done." Wendell looked around the rookery with a sinking heart. This would take weeks to put right. The birds themselves looked neglected, their plumage dull, their eyes listless. "Have the ravens been fed properly?" he asked. "How should I know?" Yara replied. "I'm not a Maester. I command ships, not birds." She paused. "Though I suppose both require knowing which way the wind blows." There was a hint of humour in her voice, the first warmth Wendell had detected since arriving. He permitted himself a small smile. "That is true enough, my lady." "Don't call me that," she said. "I'm no lady. I'm a Kraken's daughter, and I've earned my place with steel and salt, not courtesy." She moved toward the door. "The archives are below, 2 floors down. They're in even worse shape than this, if you can believe it. Damp got into the records years ago. Most of them are ruined." She left him there among the ravens and the filth, and Wendell stood in the cold tower room, listening to the birds and the sea, and wondered what he had done to deserve this posting. But he was a Maester. He had sworn his oaths. He had a duty. So he rolled up his sleeves and began to clean. The work was hard and unpleasant, but it gave him something to focus on besides his circumstances. He spent the rest of that day and much of the next scrubbing the rookery floor, repairing broken perches, examining the ravens one by one to assess their health. Some were beyond help, too weak or too sick to recover. Those he put down as mercifully as he could, whispering the words his teachers had taught him, though he doubted the drowned god cared for such mainland customs. The remaining birds he fed properly for the first time in months, and slowly, gradually, they began to revive. The archives were worse. Yara had not exaggerated. The room was in the lowest level of the keep, half buried in the rock itself, and the damp had seeped into everything. Leather covers were warped and cracked, pages stuck together in sodden clumps, ink faded to ghostly shadows. Much of it was simply gone, lost to time and neglect, and the sea air that ruined everything it touched. Wendell salvaged what he could, carefully separating pages, laying them out to dry, copying the most important records onto fresh parchment before they disintegrated entirely. It was slow work, frustrating work, but it had to be done. He saw little of the castle's inhabitants during those first days. Servants came and went, silent and wary, bringing him food and occasionally asking for simple remedies. A poultice for a burn, a tea for a cough. He helped where he could, though he noticed they never stayed long in his presence, as though association with a Maester might mark them as somehow less Ironborn. Balon he did not see at all. Yara passed through the archives once, nodded at his progress without comment, and left. On his 5th day at Pyke, Wendell witnessed his first drowning ceremony. He heard the commotion from his chambers, chanting and the sound of many feet on stone, and curiosity drew him to follow. A crowd had gathered on the shore below the castle, where the waves crashed against black rock slick with seaweed. At the centre of the crowd stood a priest, if that was the right word. He was bare-chested, despite the cold, his skin pale and covered in scars, his hair long and matted with salt. This was a drowned priest, a servant of the drowned god, and he was preparing to bless a young man who knelt before him in the surf. Wendell watched from a distance, half hidden behind a stone outcropping, as the priest intoned prayers in a voice raw from seawater and shouting. "What is dead may never die," the crowd chanted in response, "but rises again, harder and stronger." The priest seized the young man by the shoulders and forced him down into the water, holding him under as the waves surged around them both. Wendell counted the seconds, his healer's instinct screaming at him to intervene. 10 seconds, 20, 30. The young man thrashed, but the priest's grip was iron. 40 seconds, 50. The thrashing weakened. At a full minute, the priest hauled the young man up, limp and blue, and laid him on the rocks. The crowd fell silent. For long, terrible moments, nothing happened. Then the priest leaned down and pressed on the young man's chest. Once, twice, 3 times, forcing the water from his lungs. The young man convulsed, coughed, vomited seawater, and drew a great gasping breath. The crowd erupted in cheers. "What is dead may never die." The young man was helped to his feet, stumbling and weak, but alive, blessed by the drowned god, reborn in salt and sea. Wendell turned away, his stomach churning. This was their healing, their medicine, drowning and resurrection, faith and fear, and the brutal hope that the next breath would come. He thought of his training, his careful study of the body's workings, the precise application of knowledge to preserve life. Here, none of that mattered. Here, the gods decided, and men either lived or drowned. That night, alone in his chamber, Wendell began a private journal. He had kept such records before, but never with such purpose. He would document what he saw here, the customs and the conflicts, the strange marriage of faith and violence that defined these people. Perhaps, he thought, if he could understand them, he could serve them better. Or perhaps he was simply trying to make sense of a world that defied all the logic he had been taught to value. Outside his window, the sea roared its eternal song, indifferent and vast. Wendell dipped his quill in ink and began to write. The summons came 3 weeks after Wendell's arrival, delivered by the same grey-haired servant who had first led him to Balon's hall. "Lord Balon commands your presence in the great hall," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Bring your writing materials. There will be ravens to send." Wendell gathered his things quickly, his heart beating faster than he cared to admit. In his time at Pyke, he had settled into a quiet routine of tending the rookery, salvaging what remained of the archives, and treating the occasional servant who dared seek his help. He had not been called before the Lord again, and he had begun to think perhaps he never would be. Balon Greyjoy did not strike him as a man who valued counsel from Maesters. But ravens meant messages, and messages meant events were unfolding. Wendell followed the servant through the damp corridors with growing unease. The great hall was more crowded than he had ever seen it. Ironborn captains filled the space, hard men in salt-stained leather and mail, their faces weathered by wind and sea. They stood in small clusters, speaking in low voices, hands resting on sword hilts. The air was thick with tension and the smell of unwashed bodies and damp wool. At the far end of the hall, Balon sat in his driftwood chair, and beside him stood both his daughter Yara and a young man Wendell didn't recognize at first. Then he saw the way the young man carried himself, the desperate pride in his bearing, the fine cut of his clothes that sat awkwardly on a frame, more accustomed to mainland fashion. This was Sion Greyjoy, the son who had been taken as a ward to Winterfell after his father's failed rebellion years ago. The son who had grown to manhood among wolves instead of krakens. Wendell had heard of his return, whispered about by servants, but this was his first glimpse of the young man. Theon stood near his father, but not too near, like a man uncertain of his welcome, trying too hard to appear at ease. Balon rose from his chair, and the hall fell silent. He was not a tall man, but he had presence, the kind of authority that came not from size, but from absolute certainty. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the hall. "The war of the 5 kings bleeds the realm dry," he said. "Stark fights Lannister. Baratheon fights Baratheon. They tear at each other like dogs over a bone, and they have forgotten the iron price. They have forgotten what it means to take what is yours with strength and steel." He paused, letting his words settle over the assembly. "They have forgotten us." A murmur ran through the captains, a sound like surf on rocks. Wendell found a place near the wall and set down his writing materials, trying to make himself inconspicuous. His hands were steady as he prepared his parchment and ink, but his mind was racing. He knew where this was going. Every Maester learned the history of the Iron Islands, the long catalogue of raids and rebellions, the pride that would not bend, and the ambition that would not die. "The North is weakest now," Balon continued. "Robb Stark has taken his strength south to fight the Lannisters. Winterfell stands with a skeleton garrison. The coast is undefended. The time has come to take back what was stolen from us." His voice grew harder, colder. "The time has come to make the North remember the iron price." The hall erupted. Captains roared their approval, fists pounding on tables, weapons rattling. Wendell watched their faces, and saw hunger there, the same hunger he had seen in the eyes of the drowned priest, forcing a man beneath the waves. These were reavers, and they had been kept leashed too long. Now their lord was slipping that leash, and they were eager to run. Balon raised a hand, and silence fell again, immediate and complete. "I claim the North," he said, and his voice was iron itself. "I claim the crown of salt and rock, the crown of the Iron Islands, and the lands we will take back with steel. What was taken from us we will reclaim. What is dead may never die." "But rises again, harder and stronger," the captains roared in response, and the sound shook the stones of the ancient hall. Wendell felt cold despite the press of bodies around him. This was madness. Balon had tried this before, 16 years ago, and it had ended in defeat and the death of his sons. Robert Baratheon had crushed the Iron Islands, and only Ned Stark's mercy had allowed Balon to keep his head and his seat. Now Balon was doing it again, and Wendell could see no way this ended differently. The North might be weakened, but it was still the North, vast and hard and unforgiving. And behind the North stood the rest of the realm, distracted now but not blind. This rebellion would fail. The only question was how many would die before it did. But he was a Maester, and Maesters did not speak such thoughts aloud, not in a hall full of armed men, drunk on dreams of glory. So Wendell kept his face carefully blank and his eyes on his parchment as Balon began issuing orders. The ceremony came next, and it was unlike any coronation Wendell had witnessed or read about in the histories. There was no sept, no septon, no holy oils or prayers to the seven. Instead, Aeron Damphair entered the hall, the same drowned priest Wendell had seen on the shore weeks before. He carried a driftwood crown, ancient and grey, its points carved to resemble the towers of Pyke. Salt water dripped from his hair and beard, leaving a trail across the stone floor. "Balon of House Greyjoy," the priest intoned, his voice the rasp of surf on shale. "Will you pay the iron price? Will you take what is yours with blood and steel?" "I will," Balon replied, and there was something almost religious in his certainty. "Will you fear no man, bow to no king, serve no god but the drowned god who made you?" "I will." Aaron Damphair placed the driftwood crown on Balon's head. "Then rise, king of the Iron Islands and the North. What is dead may never die." "But rises again, harder and stronger," the hall thundered, and Wendell watched a middle-aged lord proclaim himself king with the backing of a few dozen ships and a faith built on drowning. He wanted to laugh. He wanted to weep. He did neither. He simply observed and made notes, careful and precise, because that was what Maesters did. After the ceremony, Balon began assigning commands. Yara was given 8 longships and told to take the stony shore, to raid and burn, and remind the North that the Ironborn had returned. She accepted the command with a nod, no emotion visible on her hard face, but Wendell thought he saw something in her eyes. Not doubt, exactly, but anima perhaps, a kind of weary knowledge, the understanding of a person who knows they are being asked to participate in folly, but will do so anyway, because duty demands it. Then Balon turned to Theon, and the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. Theon stepped forward, his face eager, almost desperate. This was his chance to prove himself, to show his father he was truly Ironborn, despite his years among the wolves. Wendell could see it written in every line of the young man's body. "You will take 30 men," Balon said, and Wendell heard the dismissiveness in his tone, even if Theon did not. "Strike at the fishing villages along the stony shore, burn their boats, take their stores, make them fear the Kraken." For a moment Theon's face fell. Then he rallied, forcing confidence into his voice. "Father, give me a true command. Let me take Winterfell itself. It stands nearly empty. With surprise and speed." "You think yourself clever enough to take Winterfell?" Balon's voice was cutting. "You think, because you grew up in that castle, you know how to conquer it. You know nothing of conquest, boy. You know only what the wolves taught you." The hall was silent now, the kind of silence that made every breath audible. Theon's face flushed red, but he pressed on. "I know Winterfell's weaknesses. I know the layout, the garrison's strength, the—" "You will do as I command," Balon said, his voice flat and final, "or you will do nothing at all." Theon's jaw worked, but no words came. He nodded once, stiffly, and stepped back. Wendell saw the humiliation in his eyes, the rage and shame, and he thought, here is a young man trying to be 2 things at once, and succeeding at neither. Not Ironborn enough for his father, not Northern enough for the Starks, caught between 2 worlds, and welcome in neither. The meeting continued. All the captains received their orders, their assignments along the vulnerable northern coast. The plan was simple: strike hard, strike fast, take what could be taken before the North could organize a response. There was a brutal logic to it, Wendell had to admit. But logic and wisdom were not the same thing, and he could see the flaw at the heart of this strategy. They were not strong enough to hold what they took. They were raiders pretending to be conquerors, and the difference would cost them everything. When the captains finally disperse, Wendell was left with a long list of messages to send. Ravens to the other Iron Islands, calling the strength of House Greyjoy. Ravens to ships at sea, recalling them to Pyke. No ravens to the mainland, of course. This rebellion would announce itself with fire and blood, not parchment and ink. He spent the rest of that day and much of the night in the rookery, carefully composing messages and attaching them to Raven's legs. The birds seemed to sense something in the air, more restless than usual, muttering and flapping in their perches. Or perhaps Wendell was simply projecting his own unease onto them. He worked by lamplight, his fingers cramping from the cold and the repetitive motion, and tried not to think about what these messages would set in motion. Yara found him there near midnight. She climbed the stairs without announcement and stood in the doorway watching him work. "Still awake, Maester? The ravens will not send themselves, my lady." He caught himself. "Forgive me. You asked me not to call you that." She waved a hand dismissively. "I've been called worse things." She moved into the room, examining the ravens with what seemed like genuine interest. "How many have you sent?" 14 so far, another 6 to go. And they'll all reach their destinations. The birds, I mean. They won't get lost or eaten by hawks or decide to take a detour." There was something in her voice, almost like humour, and Wendell found himself smiling despite his exhaustion. "Ravens are remarkably reliable, actually. They have an instinct for home. Train them properly, and they'll fly where you need them to fly." "Unlike people," Yara said. "Unlike people," Wendell agreed. She was quiet for a moment, watching him attach a message to a raven's leg. Then, "You think we're mad, don't you? You think this is folly?" Wendell's hands stilled. He could lie, offer platitudes, play the neutral servant. But something in Yara's voice made him think she wanted honesty, not courtesy. "I think," he said carefully, "that the North is larger and harder than your father remembers. I think the realm is distracted now, but not forever. And I think victories won on surprise do not last once the enemy gathers their strength." "You're not wrong," Yara said, and her voice was tired. "But we're Ironborn. We don't conquer and hold. We raid and reave and take the iron price. It's what we've always done. It's what we are." She paused. "My father needs this. Needs to prove he's still the man who defied Robert Baratheon, even if that defiance crushed us. Pride is a dangerous thing, Maester. It makes men do stupid things. But it's all some men have left." Wendell released the raven, watching it wing away into the darkness. "And you? Do you need this?" Yara laughed, a short, bitter sound. "I'm a Kraken's daughter. I go where my father commands. I do what must be done. Need doesn't enter into it." She turned toward the door, then paused. "My brother thinks he can win our father's approval by being bold, by proving himself more Ironborn than the Ironborn. He's wrong. Our father will never see him as anything but the boy who was raised by wolves. But Theon won't realize that until it's too late." "Can you not speak to him?" Wendell asked. "Warn him?" He wouldn't listen. And even if he did, what would it change? "We are what we are, Maester. We play the roles the gods and our fathers give us, and we live or die by how well we play them." She left then, her footsteps echoing down the stone stairs. Wendell returned to his work, but Yara's words stayed with him. "We are what we are." Perhaps that was true. Perhaps people were like the ravens, flying where instinct and training drove them, unable to choose a different path even when they could see the cliff approaching. Or perhaps that was simply what people told themselves to make sense of choices they knew were wrong but made anyway. The final raven launched just before dawn, disappearing into the grey light that passed for morning on the Iron Islands. Wendell descended from the rookery, his eyes burning from lack of sleep, and found the castle already stirring. Captains were gathering their crews. Ships were being loaded with weapons and supplies. The machinery of war was grinding into motion, and there was no stopping it now. He crossed one of the swaying rope bridges on his way back to his chambers and made the mistake of looking down. Far below, the sea churned against the rocks, hungry and patient. Wendell thought about Balon's driftwood crown, and Theon's desperate eyes, and Yara's weary acceptance. He thought about all the ravens he had sent, carrying messages that would bring men to war. His hands, he realized, weren't clean in this. He was part of it now, whether he wished to be or not. A Maester served. That was the oath. Served faithfully, without judgment, without choosing sides. But as Wendell reached the safety of solid stone and continued toward his chambers, he wondered if neutrality was truly possible. If simply being present, simply following orders, simply sending the ravens when told to send them, made him complicit in what was coming. He had no answer. So he did what he always did when troubled. He went to his desk, opened his private journal, and began to write, recording, documenting, bearing witness. It was not much, but it was all he knew how to do. Outside, the castle prepared for war, and in his small, damp chamber, Wendell wrote by candlelight and tried to believe that words on parchment mattered in a world ruled by steel and salt, and the brutal certainty of men who called themselves kings. The longships departed on a cold morning 2 weeks after Balon's coronation. Wendell watched from the sea tower as they sailed out of Lordsport. Black sails unfurled, oars churning the grey water to white foam. Yara's fleet went first, 8 ships sliding through the harbour mouth like hunting wolves. Then came the others, captains whose names Wendell was only beginning to learn, each leading their small squadrons north and east toward the vulnerable coastline. Theon's company left last, a modest force that looked almost pitiful compared to the others. Wendell saw the young man standing at the prow of his ship, staring straight ahead, his posture stiff with what might have been determination or simply wounded pride. Then they were gone, swallowed by mist and distance, and Pyke settled into an uneasy quiet. The castle felt emptier, with so many fighting men departed, the halls echoing with absence. Those who remained were the old, the young, the servants, and the handful of guards left to defend the seat of House Greyjoy. And Wendell, of course. The Maester who sent the ravens and kept the records and tried to make sense of a world that seemed determined to resist all sense. He threw himself into his work with renewed focus, partly because there was much to do, and partly because work kept darker thoughts at bay. The rookery was finally in good order, the birds healthy and responsive, the perches clean and secure. The archives were another matter entirely. Wendell spent his mornings there, carefully sorting through damaged records, trying to reconstruct what had been lost to damp and neglect. It was slow, frustrating labour, and often futile. Entire years of correspondence had simply rotted away, leaving gaps in the historical record that could never be filled. One morning, he found a ledger that had somehow survived mostly intact, its oiled leather cover having protected the pages within. It was a record of House Greyjoy's holdings from 20 years past, before Balon's first rebellion, and Wendell studied it with growing fascination. Here were careful notations of livestock counts, crop yields from the few farms that could coax life from the rocky soil, tallies of ships and men and weapons. Someone had kept these records with meticulous attention, a maester or steward who understood the value of accurate accounting. Wendell decided to create a new ledger to document the current state of Pyke's resources. It was practical work, useful work, the kind of task his training had prepared him for. He began making rounds of the castle, counting stores of grain and salt fish, cataloguing weapons in the armory, assessing the condition of the remaining ships in harbour. He filled page after page with neat columns of numbers, finding comfort in their precision. It was this work that brought him into conflict with the Ironborn way of thinking. He was in the granary, tallying sacks of barley, when one of Ballon's remaining captains found him. The man was called Ralph Stonehouse, a thick-bodied fighter with a face like weathered oak and eyes that held no warmth. "What are you doing, Maester?" he asked, his tone suggesting he already knew and disapproved. "Taking inventory of the castle's stores," Wendell replied, not looking up from his counting. "It's important to know what supplies we have, how long they'll last, what we might need to—" "We do not sow," Ralph interrupted. "We take what we need. We're Ironborn. We don't count grain like farmers." Wendell set down his quill and turned to face the captain. "Even raiders must eat, Captain Stonehouse. And unless I'm mistaken, there are no ships out reaving at the moment to bring back supplies, which means we must rely on what we have here until they return." Ralph's face darkened. "You speak like a Greenlander, like someone who's forgotten the old way. We pay the iron price for what we want. We don't hoard it like merchants counting coppers." "The iron price," Wendell said carefully, "does not fill an empty belly when winter comes. Courage and steel are admirable qualities, but they make poor substitutes for food when the stores run dry." For a moment he thought Ralph might strike him. The captain's hand moved toward his sword, and Wendell felt his heartbeat quicken. But then Ralph seemed to master himself. He spat on the granary floor. "Keep your ledgers, Maester. Write your numbers, but don't think it makes you wise. The drowned god provides for strong enough to take what they need." He left, and Wendell returned to his counting with hands that shook slightly. It was not the first such encounter, and he knew it would not be the last. The cultural gulf between his training and their tradition was wide and deep, and he was learning that trying to bridge it could be dangerous. The conflict emerged even more starkly in his medical practice, limited though it was. Word had spread among the servants that the new Maester actually knew his craft, that he could ease pain and heal wounds without resorting to drowning or leeches or folk remedies that did more harm than good. They came to him quietly, usually after dark, seeking help for ailments they dared not take to the drowned priests. One night, a young servant girl appeared at his door, her face pale with pain, her hand wrapped in bloody cloth. Wendell ushered her inside quickly and examined the wound by lamplight. She had cut herself badly on a broken bottle, the gash deep and dirty. It needed cleaning, stitching, careful bandaging to prevent infection. "This will hurt," he told her gently, "but I need to clean the wound thoroughly. Can you be brave for me?" She nodded, biting her lip, and Wendell set to work. He cleaned the cut with boiled wine, the girl gasping but not crying out, then stitched it closed with small, neat sutures. He applied a poultice of honey and herbs to prevent infection and wrapped the hand in clean linen. "Change the bandage daily," he instructed. "Keep it clean and dry. Come back in a week so I can check the stitches." "Thank you, Maester," she whispered. "The drowned men, they would have just blessed me to the god. made me prove my strength by drowning. But I'm not strong. I'm just a servant girl, and I was afraid." After she left, Wendell sat in his chamber and stared at his hands. How many people on these islands suffered and died from injuries and illnesses that could be easily treated with proper knowledge? How many chose pain or death over the drowning rituals, too afraid to submit to that brutal test of faith? And how many who did submit never rose again, their bodies offered to the sea, because the drowned god had found them wanting? He had learned something of the drowned priest's methods through observation and careful questioning. When someone was injured or ill, the priests would take them to the shore and force them beneath the waves, holding them under until they stopped struggling. Then they would drag them out and attempt to revive them, pressing on the chest to expel the water from the lungs. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it did not. And when it did not, the priests would say the drowned god had claimed them, that they had not been strong enough to serve. It was, Wendell had to admit, not entirely without logic. The near drowning and revival did sometimes produce a kind of desperate vitality in those who survived, a renewed appreciation for life and breath. And the chest compressions were not so different from techniques Wendell himself had learned for reviving those who had stopped breathing. But the waste of it, the unnecessary risk, the lives lost to a practice that valued faith over knowledge, it troubled him deeply. He tried once to explain to Aaron Damper that there were other ways to heal, gentler methods that did not require drowning. He found the priest on the shore one grey afternoon, standing knee-deep in surf, his arms raised to the sky as he prayed to his god. "Drowned priest," Wendell called out, approaching carefully. "Might I speak with you?" Aaron turned, his eyes distant and strange. "The master of the castle. What does a servant of the citadel want with a servant of the drowned god?" "I wanted to speak about healing," Wendell said. "I have noticed that many here are reluctant to seek medical help because they fear the blessing of drowning. But there are other methods, gentler ways to treat illness and injury that do not require such trials." Aaron's face hardened. "You speak of weakness, of avoiding the god's test. The drowned god gives us strength through drowning. What is dead may never die. Those who survive are reborn, harder and stronger. Those who do not were not meant to live." But what of those who might have lived with proper treatment? What of the servant with a fever who dies beneath the waves when a simple tea might have cured her? What of the warrior with a broken leg who drowns when setting the bone and splinting it would have had him walking again? "If the god wanted them to live, they would rise from the sea," Aaron said, his voice like stone. "If they do not, it is because they were weak, and the weak have no place in the drowned god's kingdom. Your mainland medicine is the crutch of cowards. We are Ironborn. We do not hide from death. We embrace it, knowing we will be reborn." There was no arguing with such certainty. Wendell tried a different approach. Even so, surely there is value in preserving the strong, in keeping warriors healthy so they can fight another day. My medicines do not replace faith. They simply help the body heal itself. Aaron studied him with those unsettling eyes. "You do not understand us, Maester. You do not understand what it means to pay the iron price, to take life with your own hands, and know you have earned what you hold. Your potions and your stitches, they come too easily. They cost nothing. They have no value." The drowned god's blessing must be earned in salt and suffering, or it means nothing at all. He turned back to the sea, dismissing Wendell without another word. The Maester walked back to the castle alone, feeling the weight of futility settle on his shoulders like wet wool. Yet he continued his work. The servants still came to him in secret, and he helped them when he could. He treated cuts and burns, set broken fingers, dispensed remedies for coughs and aches. He did it quietly, asking nothing in return, and slowly he built a small network of people who trusted him. It was not much, but it was something. He found an unexpected ally in the castle's septon, a man he'd glimpsed only occasionally during his first weeks at Pyke. The septon was old, perhaps 70, with wispy white hair and hands that trembled with palsy. He served in secret, maintaining a small shrine to the Seven in a forgotten corner of the castle, visiting it only late at night when the Ironborn were unlikely to notice. His name was Brother Norbert, and he had served at Pyke for 30 years, through Balon's first rebellion and the hard peace that followed. Wendell discovered him one night while searching the lower levels for additional archive material. He heard singing, faint and wavering, and followed the sound to a small stone chamber lit by a single candle. Brother Norbert knelt before a crude altar, praying to the Seven who are one, and he nearly collapsed in fear when he saw Wendell in the doorway. "Peace, brother," Wendell said quickly. "I mean you no harm. I am the castle's Maester. I stumbled upon you by accident." The old Septon's fear gradually eased. "You will not tell Lord Balon?" "Why would I? A man's faith is his own business." Brother Norbert relaxed slightly, gesturing for Wendell to enter. "Forgive me. I have learned to be cautious. The Ironborn do not look kindly on the faith. To them, I am a relic, tolerated only because I am harmless and old." They spoke for a while that night, two men of learning and faith in a place that valued neither. Brother Norbert told Wendell of his years at Pyke, of baptizing Balon's children in secret, of maintaining his quiet vigil in the face of indifference and occasional hostility. "I stay because I must," he said, "because even here, especially here, the Seven's light is needed, even if only a few servants come to pray with me in the darkness." Wendell visited Brother Norbert regularly after that, finding comfort in conversations with someone who understood the tension between duty and doubt, between service and conscience. The old Septon had a small library of his own, religious texts mostly, but also a few practical books on herbalism and natural philosophy. They traded knowledge, the Maester teaching the Septons about medicine, the Septon sharing what he knew of the castle's history and the people who inhabited it. "You are troubled," Brother Norbert observed one evening, watching Wendell stare into the candle flame. "I am caught between worlds," Wendell admitted. "I am trained to heal, to preserve life, to value knowledge and reason. But here, those things are seen as weakness. Here, strength is everything, and strength is proven through suffering and violence. I do not know how to serve people who reject what I have to offer." "You serve them anyway," Brother Norbert said gently. "As I do. We offer what we can, even when it is refused. We maintain our vigil, even in the darkness. That is all any of us can do." The weeks passed. Ravens arrived with increasing frequency, carrying news from the mainland. Wendell read each message carefully, decoding the reports of raids along the northern coast, of villages burned and ships taken, of small victories that Balon counted as proof of his strategy's success. But Wendell also read the silences between the words, the things the messages did not say. There were no reports of significant territorial gains, no castles taken, no lords bent to Balon's will, just raids and retreats, the ancient pattern of reaving, profitable perhaps, but not conquest. And then came the raven from Theon. Wendell was alone in the rookery when the bird arrived, exhausted from a long flight, bearing a message sealed with wax. He unrolled it with practiced fingers and read the words, then read them again, unable to quite believe what he was seeing. Theon had taken Winterfell, not raided it, not struck and fled, taken it. The ancient seat of House Stark, held by the kings of Winter for thousands of years, had fallen to Balon's landless son and a few dozen men. The message was brief but triumphant, describing the surprise attack, the minimal resistance, the capture of the castle and its inhabitants. Theon styled himself Prince of Winterfell and called for reinforcements to hold his prize. Wendell sat in the rookery for a long time, the message in his hand, trying to understand what this meant. It was impossible. It was brilliant. It was a disaster waiting to happen. Theon had done what no one thought he could do, had proven himself bold and clever and ruthless. But he had also put himself in a trap. Winterfell was deep in the north, surrounded by enemy territory, supplied by a single long road that could be easily cut. Holding it would require far more men than Theon had. And if Robb Stark learned his home had been taken, nothing would stop him from bringing his entire army north to take it back. Wendell carried the message down to Balon's hall, where the Lord sat with his remaining captains, studying maps and drinking sour ale. He handed over the message without comment, and watched Balon's face as he read. For a moment, something flickered in Balon's eyes, surprise perhaps, or recognition, but it was quickly buried beneath harder emotions. When he looked up, his expression was cold. "My fool of a son has overreached," he said flatly. "He has taken a castle he cannot hold with men he does not have." "He asks for reinforcements, my lord," one of the captains ventured. "Does he? How generous of him to ask." Balon tossed the message onto the table. Let him hold Winterfell with what he has. He wanted to prove himself Ironborn. Let him prove it. "My lord," Wendell said carefully, "if Winterfell falls back to the Starks, it'll be a significant blow to morale. Perhaps the Maester should tend to his ravens and leave strategy to warriors." Balon snapped. "My son chose his course. Let him live or die by it." Wendell bowed and withdrew, but he felt sick. Balon was abandoning Theon. Not out of ignorance or lack of resources, but out of pride and spite. The son who had been raised by wolves would receive no help from the Kraken. It was cruel and stupid, and entirely in keeping with everything Wendell had learned about Balon Greyjoy. That night, he wrote in his journal by candlelight, recording the day's events with his usual careful detail. But at the end, he added a personal note, something he rarely allowed himself in these supposedly objective records. "I understand now that this rebellion was never about conquest or strategy or even about winning. It is about pride. Lord Balon's pride, wounded 16 years ago and never healed. He does not seek to rule the North. He seeks to prove he was right to rebel the first time, that he could have won if only the realm had not united against him. His son's success threatens that narrative, and so the son must fail. We are all trapped in the orbit of one man's wounded pride, and we will burn when it finally consumes him." He set down his quill and looked out the window at the dark sea. Somewhere out there, Theon Greyjoy sat in Winterfell, waiting for help that would never come. And here in Pyke, his father drank ale and planned new raids and refused to see the trap closing around them all. Wendell blew out his candle and lay in his narrow bed, listening to the eternal voice of the sea. "We are what we are," Yara had said. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps they were all simply playing roles assigned by fate and fathers, unable to choose different paths, even when those paths led to ruin. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, knowing tomorrow would bring more ravens, more news, more small disasters building toward a larger one. Outside, the sea roared, and the wind howled, and Pyke stood on its crumbling stacks of stone, waiting for the storm to break. The ravens came more frequently after Theon's initial message, each one bearing words that grew progressively more desperate. Wendell read them all, watching the story unfold in fragments of ink on parchment, piecing together a narrative that grew darker with each passing day. The first few messages maintained Theon's triumphant tone. He described the taking of Winterfell in detail that seemed designed to impress his father. How he had scaled the walls with grappling hooks in the dark hours before dawn. How his men had surprised the skeleton garrison and secured the castle before the alarm could be raised. How he had taken Bran Stark and his younger brother Rickon as hostages, securing compliance from the castle's people. It was bold work, Wendell had to admit. The kind of raid that would be sung about in the feast halls, if it succeeded. But then the tone began to shift. The fourth raven mentioned difficulties with the small folk, who refused to acknowledge Theon's authority despite the occupation. The fifth spoke of Stark loyalists in the surrounding countryside, men who watched the castle and prevented foraging parties from gathering supplies. The sixth described the execution of 2 men who had tried to escape, their heads mounted on the walls as a warning. Wendell noted the defensiveness in that message, the way Theon justified the killings as necessary, as the iron price, as what any Ironborn lord would do. The 7th raven was shorter, more urgent. Theon reported that Bran and Rickon Stark had escaped in the night, aided by wildlings and the castle's former master-at-arms. He had sent men to hunt them down, but the boys knew the land and had help. The message ended with another plea for reinforcements. "Send men," Theon wrote. "Send ships. I can hold Winterfell, but I need the strength to do it properly." Wendell carried each message to Balon, and each time the Lord's response was the same cold dismissal. Let him hold it himself. He wanted glory. Let him earn it. Yara had returned from her raids on the stony shore, her ships heavy with plunder, and her men singing victory songs. She read Theon's messages with a grimmer eye than her father. "He's trapped," she said bluntly, standing in Balon's hall with seawater still dripping from her hair. "Winterfell is too far inland, the supply lines are too long, and if the Stark boys are loose, every northerner within 100 miles will rally to them. Then perhaps my son will learn that boldness without wisdom leads to folly," Balon replied, not looking up from the map he was studying. "He's your son," Yara said, and there was an edge in her voice Wendell had not heard before. "Whatever else he is, whatever the wolves made him, he's still your blood. Send me with ships. Let me bring him back before this gets worse." "No." "Father?" "I said no." Balon's voice was iron. "You have your own commands to fulfill. Theon made his choice. Now he lives with it." Yara's jaw tightened, but she knew better than to argue further. She left the hall, and Wendell saw her later that day speaking quietly with some of her captains. planning something. He suspected she would try to help her brother, regardless of their father's orders. But he said nothing. It wasn't his place to interfere in the politics of House Greyjoy. The 8th Raven arrived 3 days later, and Wendell knew immediately that something had changed. The bird was half dead from exhaustion, barely able to perch, and the message it carried was stained with something that might have been blood or simply dirty water. Theon's handwriting was harder to read. The letters formed hastily, almost frantically. The Stark boys were dead. Theon claimed his huntsmen had caught them trying to reach the Wolfswood. There had been a fight. The boys had been killed. Their bodies were being brought back to Winterfell to be displayed. Proof of Theon's control. Proof that the Stark line was broken. Wendell read the message twice, then a third time, and felt something cold settle in his chest. The words were wrong somehow. Too defensive, too insistent. Theon was trying too hard to convince the reader, and perhaps himself, that this was necessary, that this was strength, that this was the iron price. But underneath the justifications, Wendell sensed desperation, and something that might have been horror at what he had done. He brought the message to Balon. The Lord read it without expression, then set it aside. "Good," he said simply. "Dead hostages are still useful if they're the right hostages. The North will know we do not make idle threats." "My lord," Wendell said carefully, "the Stark boys were children. Bran was crippled, barely 10 years old. Rickon even younger. This will not make the North fear us. It will make them hate us. Every man who might have stayed neutral will now take up arms." Balin's eyes were cold as winter sea. "The North has hated us for 1,000 years, Maester. This changes nothing." But it did change things. Wendell saw it in the faces of the servants who whispered in corners, in the way even the hardest Ironborn captains looked uncomfortable when the subject arose. Killing enemy warriors was one thing, killing children was another. There were lines that even reavers hesitated to cross, and Theon had crossed one. More ravens came. Theon described mounting the bodies on the walls of Winterfell, claiming they were the Stark boys, even though they were burned beyond easy recognition. He spoke of the silence that fell over the castle's people, the fear in their eyes, the way even the servants who had known him since childhood now looked at him as though he were a monster. His words tried to frame this as victory, as the iron price exacted, but Wendell could read the doubt bleeding through the ink. Brother Norbert found Wendell in his chamber that night, his old face troubled. "Is it true?" the Septon asked quietly. "Did Lord Theon kill the Stark children?" "That is what he claims," Wendell replied. "Whether it is true," he shook his head, "I do not know. The bodies were burned. They could be anyone. But he says they are the Stark boys." "He does." Brother Norbert was silent for a long moment. "I baptized those children," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "When Lord Eddard brought them to Pyke to visit their brother before the first rebellion, I baptized Robb and Jon in secret, gave them the blessing of the Seven, because their father wished it. Bran and Rickon were not born yet, but I knew of them through letters, through the connections I maintain with Septons in the north." He looked at Wendell with eyes that were very old and very sad. "If Theon has truly killed them, he has damned his soul. No amount of drowning in salt water will wash away that sin." Wendell had no answer for him. He was a maester, trained in reason and observation, not theology and judgment. But he understood the old Septon's grief, and he shared it in his own way. Yara departed for Winterfell the next morning, defying her father's orders. She took a small force, volunteers mostly, men loyal to her rather than to Balon's pride. Wendell watched the ships leave and wondered if she would reach her brother in time, or if she would find only ruins and corpses when she arrived. The castle fell into a tense waiting. No new messages came from Theon, and the silence was somehow worse than his desperate ravens had been. Wendell attended to his duties, maintaining the rookery, treating the sick and injured who dared seek his help, recording events in his private journal. But he felt the weight of everything pressing down on him, the sense that forces were building beyond Pyke's walls, forces that would soon crash over them all like winter waves. It was during this time that Wendell began to hear the whispers. Servants spoke in corners, captains muttered over their cups. Even the drowned priests seemed uneasy. Something was wrong. Not just with Theon's campaign, but here, at the heart of House Greyjoy's power. The whispers centered on Balon himself, on his moods and his choices, on the way he stood for hours on the rope bridges in storms, staring out at the sea as though waiting for something. Aeron Dampere was seen more frequently at the castle, emerging from the sea at strange hours to pray in the great hall or confer with Balon in private. The drowned priest's presence made everyone nervous. He was a fanatic, even by Ironborn standards, a man who had drowned and been reborn so many times that some said he was more dead than alive, more salt water than blood. When he fixed his strange eyes on you, you felt judged by something older and colder than any human authority. Wendell avoided the drowned priest when possible, but one day he found himself face to face with Aeron in the archives. The priest stood among the damaged records, his bare feet leaving wet prints on the stone floor, examining a particularly old volume that Wendell had recently salvaged. "You preserve the past, Maester," Aeron said without preamble, not looking up from the book. "You write it down, lock it in leather and ink. Why?" "Because the past teaches us," Wendell replied carefully. "Because understanding what came before helps us navigate what comes next. Because knowledge preserved is knowledge that can help future generations avoid the mistakes of the past." "The past is dead," Aeron said. "What is dead may never die, but the past does not rise again. It sinks to the bottom and feeds the crabs. Only the drowned god's will matters, and his will is written in the waves, not in your books." "Perhaps both can be true," Wendell suggested. "Perhaps the god's will and human knowledge are not enemies, but different paths to understanding." Aeron finally looked at him, and his eyes were as unsettling as Wendell had feared. "You do not believe in the drowned god." "I did not say that. You did not need to. I can see it in you. You believe in your chains and your ravens and your neat little books. You believe men can understand the world through reason and study. But the world is deeper and darker and stranger than your learning can fathom, Maester. The drowned god teaches us that death is not an ending, but a transformation. That to truly live, you must first drown." "I have seen your drowning rituals," Wendell said. "I have seen men die who might have lived with proper care. Forgive me, but I cannot see wisdom in unnecessary death." "No death is unnecessary if the drowned god wills it," Aeron replied. "And no life is certain if he does not. You maesters think you can cheat death with your potions and your stitches. But death cannot be cheated. It can only be embraced, transformed, used. That is what the Ironborn understand that you Greenlanders never will." He left then, his wet footprints slowly fading on the stone, and Wendell was left alone among the books and records, wondering what that encounter had been about. A warning? A theological debate? Or simply the musings of a man half mad from too many drownings? Days passed. Then, like a thunderclap, Yara's raven arrived. Wendell was in the rookery when the bird came, flying hard from the east, so exhausted it nearly fell from the sky before reaching its perch. He untied the message with shaking hands and read Yara's terse report. She had reached Winterfell. The castle still stood, still under Theon's control, but barely. The bodies on the walls were not the Stark boys. Yara was certain of it. They were orphans from the castle town, farm boys of similar age, killed and burned to hide their identities. Theon had lied about killing Bran and Rickon. The real Stark heirs were still alive, still loose, still rallying the North against the Ironborn occupation. Worse, northern forces were gathering. Roderick Castle, the old Master-at-Arms, was marching on Winterfell with a small army of loyal Stark men. Theon was trapped inside the castle walls with fewer than 30 fighters, surrounded by hostile territory, with no supply line and no relief force coming. Yara had offered to evacuate him, to pull back to the coast while they still could. Theon had refused. He insisted he could hold Winterfell, that help was coming, that their father would not abandon him. "I cannot save him if he will not be saved," Yara wrote. "I am withdrawing to the coast to preserve my ships and men. What happens to Theon now is in the drowned god's hands, and I pray the god is more merciful than our father." Wendell stood in the rookery for a long time after reading, the message trembling in his hands. This was it, then. The moment when Theon's gambit finally collapsed. The young man who had tried so hard to prove himself Ironborn was about to be destroyed by his own stubborn pride and his father's cold indifference. He brought the message to Balon. The Lord read it once, his face expressionless, then set it aside as he had all the others. "My lord," Wendell said, unable to stay silent, "your son is going to die. If you send ships now, immediately, there might still be time to extract him before the Northern army arrives. But if you wait, then he will die," Balon finished. "As I said, he made his choice. I will not waste good ships and men on a fool's errand to save a son who chose glory over wisdom." "He is your blood," Wendell said, and he heard the anger in his own voice, the frustration that had been building for weeks finally breaking through. "Your heir, your family, and you will let him die because he wounded your pride." Balon stood, and his presence filled the hall with cold authority. "You forget yourself, Maester. You serve at my pleasure. You exist here to send my ravens and keep my records, not to question my decisions. My son wanted to be Ironborn. Now he will learn what that truly means. The iron price is paid in blood, and sometimes that blood is your own. If Theon cannot understand that, then he is not worthy of the Greyjoy name." "The iron price," Wendell said, and he was past caring now, past caution, "is an excuse for cruelty dressed up as strength. It is a way to justify taking what you want and calling it holy. It is the philosophy of pirates and raiders who cannot build anything lasting, so they steal from those who can. And when it finally destroys you, when the North and the rest of the realm come to repay your iron price with interest, you will have no one to blame but yourself." The hall was silent. Balon's captain stared at Wendell with a mixture of shock and grudging respect. No one spoke to Balon Greyjoy like that. No one dared. Balon's face was stone. "Get out," he said quietly, "before I have you thrown from the bridge to pay your own iron price to the sea." Wendell left, his heart pounding, half expecting guards to seize him before he reached the door. But no one moved. He walked through the corridors back to his chamber, closed the door, and sat on his narrow bed, shaking with anger and fear and the terrible knowledge that he had just burned whatever small influence he might have had. That night he wrote in his journal with a hand that was not quite steady. He recorded Yara's message, Balon's response, and his own outburst. At the end he added, "I have failed. I came here to serve, to heal, to be useful. Instead, I have watched a young man be abandoned to his death, watched children murdered or falsely claimed murdered, watched pride and stubbornness lead an entire house toward ruin, and I have done nothing that mattered. I sent the ravens when told to send them. I kept the records when told to keep them. I played the part of the neutral servant, and my neutrality has made me complicit in everything I witnessed. Brother Norbert told me that we offer what we can, even when it is refused. But what use is offering if the offering changes nothing?" He set down his quill and stared at the words he had written. Outside, the sea roared its eternal song, and somewhere far to the east, Theon Greyjoy sat in Winterfell, waiting for a rescue that would never come. Wendell blew out his candle and lay in the darkness, listening to the castle settle around him. Tomorrow there would be more ravens, more messages, more small disasters building toward the larger one. But tonight he simply lay still, and wondered if there was any point to bearing witness, if the witness could do nothing to change what they saw. The sea gave no answer. It never did. The storm came on a night when the moon was dark, and the wind howled like a living thing. Wendell woke to the sound of it, the kind of storm that made even the Ironborn nervous, that sent servants scurrying to secure shutters and tie down anything that might be torn loose and flung into the sea. He lay in his narrow bed, listening to the wind shriek through the castle's cracks and crevices, feeling the stone walls shudder with each gust, and tried to sleep again. It was impossible. The storm was too loud, too violent, too alive. He rose and lit a candle, thinking he might as well work if sleep would not come. There were always records to copy, messages to organize, the endless small tasks that filled a maester's days. He was reaching for his writing materials when he heard shouting from somewhere in the castle, distant but urgent. Then running footsteps in the corridor outside, then more shouting, closer now, and the sound of many voices raised in alarm. Something was wrong. Wendell pulled on his robe and stepped into the corridor. Servants rushed past him, their faces pale in the torchlight, heading toward the main keep. He caught one by the arm, a young man he had treated for a fever weeks before. "What's happened?" "Lord Balon," the servant gasped. "He's fallen from the bridge in the storm." Wendell felt his blood turn cold. He released the servant and followed the crowd, joining the stream of people flowing through the castle's corridors toward the rope bridges that connected the various towers and keeps. The wind hit him like a fist when he stepped outside, nearly knocking him off his feet. Rain lashed down in sheets, making it almost impossible to see. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in stark flashes of white light. People clustered at the base of one of the rope bridges, the one that connected the main keep to the sea tower. The bridge itself swayed wildly in the wind, its ropes creaking and groaning, the wooden slats rattling like bones. And there, far below, on the rocks where the sea crashed and foamed, Wendell could just make out a shape that might have been a body. He pushed through the crowd, his master's training overriding his fear. "Let me through," he called. "I'm a maester, let me see." They made way for him, and he found himself face to face with Aaron Damphair. The drowned priest stood at the edge of the rocks, soaked to the skin, his hair plastered to his skull, staring down at the body below. Other men were already climbing down, risking the slippery stones and the hungry waves to reach whoever had fallen. "What happened?" Wendell shouted over the wind. Aaron turned to him, and even in the darkness and rain, Wendell could see something strange in the priest's eyes. Not grief, not shock, something else. "The drowned god has called him home," Aaron said. "What is dead may never die." It took nearly an hour to recover the body. The men who climbed down returned soaked and shaking, carrying Balon Greyjoy between them on a makeshift stretcher of sailcloth. They brought him to the great hall, laying him on the same table where he had studied maps and planned his doomed rebellion. Torches were lit. People gathered. And Wendell was called forward to examine the body and pronounce what everyone already knew. Balon Greyjoy was dead. Wendell approached slowly, aware of all the eyes on him, aware that his next actions would be watched and judged and remembered. He knelt beside the body and began his examination with careful, practiced hands. He had seen death many times, in many forms, but this was different. This was the Lord he served, the man who had commanded his presence and dismissed his counsel, who had let his son die rather than bend his pride. Balon's body was broken. His neck was twisted at an unnatural angle, clearly snapped in the fall. His skull was cracked, leaking blood and brain matter onto the sailcloth. Both legs were shattered, the bones jutting through the skin in compound fractures. There were cuts and bruises everywhere, the kind of injuries you would expect from a fall onto sharp rocks. His clothes were soaked with seawater and rain, his skin cold as stone. But it was the details that troubled Wendell, the way the body was positioned, the nature of some of the wounds. The question of how exactly a man crossed a bridge he had crossed 1,000 times before, and somehow fell to his death in a storm, when any sensible person would have waited for morning or found another route. "Well?" Aaron Damphair's voice cut through Wendell's thoughts. "What killed him, Maester?" Wendell looked up at the drowned priest, at the circle of captains and servants surrounding them, at the expectant faces waiting for his judgment. He could say what he was thinking. He could voice his suspicions. But what would that accomplish? In this hall, in this moment, with these people, the truth was whatever they decided it would be. "The fall killed him," Wendell said carefully. "His neck is broken. His skull is fractured. Death would have been immediate, or very nearly so." "The drowned god claimed him," Aaron said with satisfaction. "He walked onto that bridge in the storm, and the god judged him and found him wanting. It is divine will." Wendell wanted to argue, wanted to point out that divine will was a convenient explanation for what might have been accident or something darker. But he held his tongue and continued his examination, methodical and thorough, noting every injury, every detail. the broken bones, the lacerations, the salt water in the lungs, though that could simply be from the sea washing over the body where it fell. When he was finished, he stood and wiped his hands on a cloth someone offered him. "I will need to prepare the body for burial," he said, "or for whatever rites House Greyjoy observes." "We will give him to the sea," Aaron said, "as is proper for a king of the Iron Islands. The drowned god will take him to his watery halls, and he will feast there forever, harder and stronger than he was in life." The crowd began to disperse, people drifting away in small groups, whispering among themselves. Wendell started to follow, but a hand caught his arm. He turned to find one of Balon's captains, a man named Dagmar Cleftjaw, so called for the terrible scar that split his face from eye to chin. "A word, Maester," Dagmar said quietly, pulling Wendell into a side corridor, away from the others. "In private." They walked in silence until they were alone in a small antechamber, the sounds of the storm still audible but distant. Dagmar closed the door and turned to face Wendell, his scarred face unreadable in the flickering torchlight. "You examined the body carefully," Dagmar said. "What did you really see?" Wendell hesitated. "I saw what I said. A man who fell from a bridge and died from his injuries." "Don't play games with me, Maester. I've seen men die in every way imaginable. I've killed more than I can count. And I know when something doesn't smell right." Dagmar moved closer. "You saw something. I could tell by the way you looked at the body. What was it?" Wendell weighed his options. Dagmar was dangerous, but he was also intelligent, observant, and clearly suspicious. Lying to him would be pointless. "The injuries are consistent with a fall," Wendell said slowly. "But there are questions. Lord Balon knew those bridges better than anyone. He had crossed them in storms before. Why would he choose to cross tonight, in the worst weather in weeks? And if he did choose to cross, why would he fall? The ropes were secure. The bridge was sound. There was no obvious reason for him to lose his footing. "Unless someone helped him lose it," Dagmar said. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Wendell said nothing, and his silence was answer enough. "Can you prove it?" Dagmar asked. "Can you say for certain that he was pushed?" "No," Wendell admitted. "The injuries could have come from the fall alone. There are no defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle. If someone pushed him, they did it quickly and cleanly, giving him no chance to fight back. Or," he paused, "or he truly did fall by accident, and I am seeing conspiracy where there is only tragedy." Dagmar studied him for a long moment. "You're an honest man, Maester. Maybe too honest for a place like this. But I'll tell you what I think. Someone wanted Balon dead. Someone who stood to gain from his death. And in this castle, on this night, that list is not very long." "Who?" Wendell asked, though he thought he might already know. "Euron," Dagmar said. "The Crow's Eye, Balon's younger brother. He's been at sea for years, exiled for reasons no one talks about openly. But word is he's been sailing closer to home lately, close enough to slip into Pyke on a night like this, do what needs doing, and slip out again before dawn. And with Balon dead, the succession falls to the brothers. Euron, Victarion, Aeron, 3 men who each want different things for the Iron Islands." "Aeron is a drowned priest," Wendell said. "He claims no earthly power." "Aeron claims no crown," Dagmar corrected, "but he has more power than any king. He speaks for the drowned god, and the faithful listen. If he declares one of his brothers the rightful heir, that man becomes king. and if he declares them unworthy. He drew a finger across his throat. Wendell thought about Aeron's reaction at the bridge, the strange look in his eyes, the too quick acceptance of Balon's death as divine will. "You think Aeron knew," he said, "or was part of it?" "I think the drowned men know more than they say," Dagmar replied. "I think this night had watchers, and they watched Balon die without raising an alarm. Make of that what you will." "What will you do with this suspicion?" Wendell asked. Dagmar laughed, a harsh sound without humour. "Nothing. What can I do? Balon is dead. Accusing his brothers of murder without proof would start a war within House Greyjoy itself. Better to let the succession play out, see who comes out on top, and hope the new king remembers who served him loyally." He moved toward the door, then paused. "But you, Maester, you keep your records, don't you? You write things down?" "I do." "Then write this down. Write what you saw, what you suspect, what we talked about tonight. Lock it away in your archives, because someday someone might need to know the truth about this night, or maybe no one will ever care. Either way, the truth should be recorded. That's what Maesters do, isn't it? Bear witness." He left, and Wendell was alone in the small chamber, listening to the storm rage outside and thinking about what had been said and unsaid. He had suspected murder the moment he saw the body, but suspicion and proof were different things, and in a place like Pyke, accusations without proof were dangerous. He returned to his chamber and sat at his desk, staring at his journal for a long time before he began to write. He recorded everything: the storm, the fall, the examination of the body, his conversation with Dagmar. He wrote down his suspicions and doubts, his observations about the timing and the circumstances. He noted Aeron's strange reaction, the questions about Euron, the political implications of Balon's death. When he was finished, he sealed the pages with wax and hid them in a false bottom of his document chest, a secret compartment he had created years ago for storing sensitive materials. If anyone searched his chamber, they would find his official records, carefully neutral and factual. But the truth, such as he understood it, would remain hidden until the day it was safe, or necessary, to reveal it. The funeral was held 2 days later, when the storm had passed, and the sea was calm enough for the ceremony. They carried Balon's body down to the shore on a bier of driftwood, wrapped in a sailcloth shroud. Aeron Damphair led the rites, intoning prayers to the drowned god in his raw, salt-damaged voice. The captains and lords of the Iron Islands gathered to witness, all of them calculating, Wendell suspected, how this death would affect their own positions and prospects. "What is dead may never die," Aeron chanted, and the crowd responded in kind. They placed Balon's body on a small boat laden with stones, pushed it out into the waves, and watched it sink beneath the grey water. The last king of the Iron Islands returned to the sea that had made his people. Wendell watched from the edge of the gathering, noting who stood where, who spoke to whom, who seemed pleased, and who seemed troubled. Victarion Greyjoy was there, Balon's younger brother, a huge man of impressive strength and limited imagination. He stood like a stone, his face showing nothing, but his hands kept clenching and unclenching, as though he wanted to hit something but could not decide what. Yara stood apart from the others, her face hard as the rocks beneath their feet. She had returned from the mainland too late to see her father alive, and Wendell thought he saw guilt in her eyes, mixed with grief and anger. She had defied Balon to try to save Theon, and now Balon was dead, and Theon was still trapped in Winterfell, and the whole succession was thrown into chaos. What surprised Wendell was the absence. Euron was not there. The Crow's Eye, Balon's younger brother, the man Dagmar suspected of murder, was nowhere to be seen. Some muttered that he was still at sea, still in exile, unaware of his brother's death. Others whispered that he knew very well what had happened, and was simply biding his time, waiting for the right moment to return and claim what he believed was his. After the funeral, the castle descended into uneasy tension. With Balon dead and no clear successor named, the power structure of House Greyjoy was suddenly uncertain. Victarion had strength and loyalty, but he was not clever. Aeron had the faith and the fanatics, but he claimed no crown. Yara had competence and experience, but she was a woman, and the Ironborn were not known for accepting female leadership, ancient precedents notwithstanding. And Euron was the wild card, the unknown variable, the man whose very absence made him loom larger in everyone's calculations. Wendell heard the servants whispering about the succession. Some favoured Victarion, seeing him as strong and predictable. Others thought Aeron would choose the next king through divine authority. A few brave souls suggested Yara, pointing out that she'd actually led successful raids while her brothers had either failed or fled. But most simply waited to see what would happen, keeping their heads down and their opinions to themselves. It was Brother Norbert who brought Wendell the strangest piece of news. The old Septon came to his chamber late one night, agitated and fearful. "There are ships in the harbour," he whispered. "Ships that arrived today without announcement, flying no banners. The sailors who saw them say they're foreign-built, strange designs, crewed by men who look like they've sailed through hell itself." "Euron," Wendell said, and it was not a question. "The Crow's Eye has returned," Brother Norbert confirmed, "and he brings madness with him. The servants who have seen him say he wears an eye patch now, that his smile is the smile of a man with no soul, that he speaks of dragons and krakens and the end of the world as though they were pleasant topics for dinner conversation." Wendell felt dread settle in his stomach like a stone. When will he make himself known? "Tomorrow," they say, "he will call for a king's moot, the ancient tradition of choosing a king by acclaim. It has not been done in thousands of years, but Aeron supports it. Says it is the drowned god's will that the Ironborn choose their own king rather than accepting rule by birth alone. A king's moot, a gathering of all the lords and captains of the Iron Islands to choose their next ruler by vote and acclamation. It was a clever move, Wendell had to admit. It bypassed the question of succession and threw everything open to whoever could make the most persuasive case. And if Euron was as charismatic and mad as the rumours suggested, he might well talk his way onto the Seastone chair. "What will you do?" Brother Norbert asked. "What can I do?" Wendell replied. "I am a Maester. I serve whoever rules. If they choose Victarion, I serve Victarion. If they choose Euron, I serve Euron. My opinions do not matter." "But you'll be there? You'll witness it?" "I will witness it," Wendell said, "and I will record what I see, for whatever good that does." Brother Norbert nodded slowly. "Then pray for us all, Maester, because I fear we are about to witness the Iron Islands choose their own damnation, and there will be nothing any of us can do to stop it." He left, and Wendell sat alone in his chamber, staring at the candle flame and thinking about power and succession and the terrible choices people made when they believed themselves chosen. by gods. Outside, the sea whispered its eternal secrets, and in the harbour, Euron Crow's-Eye's strange ships rocked gently at anchor, waiting for morning and the chaos that would surely follow. Wendell wrote in his journal until the candle burned low, recording everything, bearing witness to history as it unfolded. It was all he knew how to do. It was all he had ever known how to do. And as he sealed another set of pages and hid them away, he wondered if anyone would ever read them, or if they would simply rot away like all the other records in Pyke's damp archives, forgotten and meaningless. The sea had no answer. It never did. The journey to Old Wick took 2 days by ship, sailing through grey waters under greyer skies. Wendell had never been to the ancient island, though he had read about it in the histories. Old Wick was where the Iron Islands had been ruled from in ancient times, before Aegon's conquest, before even the Whores had built their kingdom. It was holy ground to the Ironborn, the place where their traditions ran deepest, where the drowned god's presence was said to be strongest. It was fitting, Wendell supposed, that they would choose their new king there. The ship that carried him was crowded with captains and their crews, all sailing to attend the king's moot. The mood aboard was strange, a mixture of excitement and tension, like men going to a feast that might turn into a fight at any moment. Wendell kept to himself, finding a quiet corner near the stern where he could watch the sea and think about what was coming. He had seen Euron Greyjoy only once since the Crow's-Eye's return, a brief glimpse across the courtyard at Pyke. The man was tall and lean, with dark hair and a black eye patch covering his left eye. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never doubted himself, never questioned his right to take what he wanted. His smile was easy and cold at the same time, the smile of a man who found the world amusing but ultimately beneath him. Just that brief glimpse had been enough to make Wendell uneasy. There was something wrong about Euron Greyjoy, something that went deeper than mere cruelty or ambition. He was like a hole in the world, a space where something human should have been but was not. The other candidates were more conventional, at least. Victarion was exactly what he appeared to be, a strong, loyal warrior with more courage than wit. He would make a predictable king, fierce in battle, but easily manipulated by cleverer men. Yara was competent and pragmatic, but she faced the enormous obstacle of her sex. The Ironborn had accepted a woman as their leader in ancient times. The histories recorded a queen named Gwyness who had ruled 6,000 years ago. But that was legend, and legends were easier to accept than live-in women with their own ideas about power. Old Wick appeared on the horizon at dawn of the second day, a dark mass rising from the sea. As they drew closer, Wendell could see the other ships already gathered in the natural harbour, dozens of longships and trading vessels, their sails furled, their crews making camp on the shore. This would be the largest gathering of Ironborn in a generation, perhaps in a century. Every house of significance had sent representatives. Every captain who commanded more than a handful of ships had come to have their voice heard. They landed on a rocky beach and joined the stream of people moving inland toward the King's Moot site. It was held on a hill overlooking the sea, a natural amphitheatre of stone where thousands could gather and hear the speakers. Wendell found a position on the slope with the other non-combatants, maesters, priests, servants, and waited as the assembly gathered. The Ironborn came in groups, organised by house and loyalty, and took their positions on the hillside. Wendell tried to count them and gave up at 3,000. More kept arriving, climbing the path from the shore, filling the available space until the hill was a sea of weathered faces and salt-stained leather. These were hard people, tested by a hard life, and they had come to choose a leader who would either save them or lead them to destruction. Wendell suspected many of them did not care which, as long as it was done with proper Ironborn style. Aaron Damphair stood at the centre of the amphitheatre, his arms raised to the sky, leading the assembly in prayer to the drowned god. His voice carried across the hill, raw and powerful, and the crowd responded with the ritual words. What is dead may never die, but rises again, harder and stronger. When the prayers were finished, Aaron lowered his arms and surveyed the assembly with his strange, fanatic's eyes. We are gathered to choose a king, he declared, not by the laws of the Greenlands, where sons inherit from fathers without proving their worth. We choose as our ancestors chose, by the ancient right of the Kingsmoot. Let any man who would be king stand forth and make his claim. Let the captains judge and the drowned god decide. There was a moment of silence, heavy with anticipation. Then Victarion Greyjoy stepped forward from the crowd, his massive frame making other men look small by comparison. He wore mail and leather, a sword at his hip, every inch the warrior. When he spoke, his voice was deep and certain. I am Victarion of House Greyjoy, he said. I have commanded the Iron Fleet for 20 years. I have led more raids than I can count. I have taken ships from the Arbor to the Stepstones. I have paid the iron price 100 times over. He paused, looking out over the assembly. I am strong. I am loyal. I am Ironborn to the bone. Make me your king, and I will lead you to glory. I will raid the Greenlands until they remember to fear us. I will make the Iron Islands great again through strength and steel. It was a simple speech, straightforward and honest, exactly what you would expect from Victarion. The crowd's response was respectful, but not enthusiastic. They appreciated his strength, but strength alone was not enough to inspire them. They had followed strong leaders before, and it had often ended in defeat. Victarion stepped back, and there was another pause. Then Yara moved forward, and the crowd stirred with surprise and interest. She wore men's clothing, as always, and she carried herself with the same confidence as any male captain. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong. I am Yara of House Greyjoy, she said, daughter of Balon, who was king. I have led 8 ships on raids along the stony shore. I took 3 castles and burned 24 villages. I brought back plunder and slaves and glory. She looked out over the crowd, meeting their eyes without flinching. I know some of you think a woman cannot lead the Ironborn, but I have done what many men only talk about. I have proven myself in battle and in command. I do not promise you glory and conquest. I promise you wisdom. I promise you survival. The Greenlands are waking to our threat. The time for easy raids is ending. We need a leader who understands when to strike and when to pull back, who can navigate the dangerous waters ahead without drowning us all in pride and ambition. It was a good speech, pragmatic and honest. Wendell saw some of the captains nodding, appreciating her realism. But he also saw others shaking their heads, uncomfortable with the idea of a woman giving them orders. The Ironborn might respect competence, but tradition ran deep, and tradition said men led while women served. Yara stepped back, and the tension on the hillside increased. Everyone knew who would speak next. Everyone had been waiting for this moment. Euron Greyjoy stepped forward, and the crowd fell silent. He did not look like his brothers. Where Victarion was massive and blunt, Euron was lean and sharp. Where Balon had been cold and proud, Euron was smiling and relaxed, as though this was all a game he had already won. He wore fine clothes, not Ironborn style, but something foreign. Silk and velvet in deep blues and blacks. His eye patch was black leather, studded with a sapphire that caught the light. And when he spoke, his voice was smooth as poison, compelling and terrible at once. "I am Euron of House Greyjoy," he said. "Some call me Crow's Eye. I have sailed farther than any Ironborn alive. I have been to Ashai by the Shadow. I have walked the smoking ruins of old Valyria. I have seen things that would drive lesser men mad, and I have brought back treasures to prove it." He gestured, and men came forward carrying a massive horn, longer than a man was tall, banded with ancient Valyrian steel, and covered in glyphs that seemed to writhe in the light. The crowd gasped and murmured. Even Wendell, who knew little of such things, could sense the power radiating from the object. "This is Dragonbinder," Euron declared. "A horn from ancient Valyria, forged in dragon fire and blood. Any man who blows this horn can bind dragons to his will. And I tell you now, brothers, there are dragons in the world again. 3 of them, across the narrow sea, held by a girl who calls herself a queen. With this horn, those dragons will be mine. With this horn, I will conquer not just the north, but all of Westeros. I will make the Iron Islands the greatest power in the known world." The silence was absolute. Then someone shouted, "Blow it! Prove it works!" Euron's smile widened. "Gladly." He turned to one of his men, a massive sailor with arms like tree trunks. "Blow the horn, Kraken. Show them its power." The man called Kraken took the horn with visible reluctance. He put it to his lips and blew, and the sound that emerged was like nothing Wendell had ever heard. It was not music. It was not noise. It was something deeper, something that resonated in the bones and blood, something that spoke to ancient fears and primal instincts. The sound rolled across the hillside like thunder, like the roar of some vast beast, and everyone who heard it felt their hearts stutter and their breath catch. When the sound finally faded, Kraken lowered the horn. His lips were blistered and bleeding. He swayed on his feet, and Euron caught him, lowering him gently to the ground. "The price of power," Euron said softly. "But what a price, eh? And what power?" Kraken coughed, blood bubbling from his lips, and died, right there, in front of 3,000 witnesses, killed by the sound of the horn he had blown. The crowd stared in shock and horror and awe. Euron stood over the body without expression. "A dragon's horn demands a dragon's price," he said. "But for those brave enough to pay it, the rewards are beyond imagining. Make me your king, and I will bring you dragons. Make me your king, and I will give you an empire. No more scraping by on raids and reaving. No more being the poor cousins of the Greenlands. With dragons, we will take the world." He stepped back, and the crowd erupted. Some shouted their support immediately, swept up in Euron's vision and the terrible proof of the horn. Others looked uncertain, troubled by what they had just witnessed. A few looked afraid, and Wendell did not blame them. He was afraid too. Euron Greyjoy was promising them everything they had ever wanted, and the price, both the immediate price and the long-term cost, was written in blood on the ground where Kragon's body lay cooling. Aeron Damper raised his hands for silence, and gradually the crowd quieted. "You have heard the claimants," the drowned priest declared. "Now you must choose. Let every man speak his mind. Let the drowned god guide your voices." What followed was chaos, controlled chaos, but chaos nonetheless. Captains stood and shouted their support for one candidate or another. Arguments broke out on the hillside, men grabbing each other and screaming in each other's faces about honor and strength and pragmatism. Wendell watched it all with a historian's detachment and a human's dread, seeing the pattern play out exactly as he had feared it would. Victarion had support, but it was shallow. Men respected him, but did not love him, trusted his strength, but not his vision. Yara had support from those who valued competence over tradition, but there were not enough of them, and she knew it. Wendell could see the resignation on her face as she watched the tide turn against her. And Euron. Euron had captured their imaginations. He had shown them something impossible and made it real. He had promised them not just survival, but glory. Not just raids, but conquest. Not just the iron price, but the whole world laid at their feet. It did not matter that his promises were mad. It did not matter that acquiring dragons would almost certainly destroy them. It didn't matter that the man himself was clearly dangerous, possibly insane, and definitely not someone who should be given power over anything more significant than a rowboat. The Ironborn wanted to believe. They wanted glory and conquest, and a return to some mythical golden age when they had ruled the seas and taken what they wanted without consequences. Euron was selling them that dream, and they were buying it, despite every reasonable voice telling them it would end in disaster. The voting, when it finally came, was overwhelming. Victarion received perhaps a third of the voices. Yara received fewer still, mostly from captains who had sailed with her and knew her competence firsthand. But Euron received the rest, a thunderous acclamation that shook the hillside. "Euron, Euron, Euron Greyjoy, King of the Iron Islands." Aeron Damper stepped forward, and Wendell thought he saw something in the drowned priest's eyes, some flicker of doubt or regret. But it passed quickly, buried beneath fanaticism and certainty. "The drowned god has spoken through his people," Aeron declared. "Euron of House Greyjoy is chosen. What is dead may never die." "But rises again, harder and stronger," the crowd roared back. They crowned Euron with the same driftwood crown that Balin had worn, the ancient symbol of Iron Island kingship. Euron took it with that same easy smile, as though he had never doubted this outcome, as though everything had gone exactly according to his plan. He looked out over the assembly, over the thousands of warriors who had just made him their king, and Wendell saw something in his one visible eye that made his blood run cold. It was not triumph, it was hunger. The hunger of a man who had been given exactly what he wanted, and was already thinking about what he would take next. "My faithful Krakens," Euron said, his voice carrying easily across the hillside. "You have made the right choice. Together, we will remake the world. Together, we will take what is ours and make the Greenlands remember why they should fear the storm. But first," he smiled, and it was the smile of a shark. "First, we must consolidate our power. We must deal with those who doubt. We must show the Iron Islands that this is a new age, and in this age, only the strong survive." Wendell did not like the sound of that. He glanced at Yara and saw her face had gone very still, very careful. Victarion looked confused, uncertain whether he should be pleased or troubled. Aaron simply watched with his strange, distant gaze, as though seeing things the rest of them could not. The king's moot was over. The choice was made. The Iron Islands had their new king, and Wendell knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same. The journey back to Pyke was quieter than the journey out. The excitement had faded, replaced by a kind of nervous energy, the feeling of people who had made a momentous decision and were now beginning to wonder if it had been the right one. Wendell stood at the ship's rail and watched Old Wick disappear into the distance, thinking about what he had witnessed. He had watched the Ironborn choose spectacle over substance, madness over pragmatism, dreams over reality. He had watched them crown a man who promised them dragons and empire, when what they needed was wisdom and restraint. And he had been unable to do anything to stop it, because he was a Maester, and Maesters observed and recorded, but did not interfere. Brother Norbert's words came back to him. We offer what we can, even when it is refused. But what good was offering if no one listened? What good was bearing witness if the witness could not prevent the disaster unfolding before his eyes? Wendell had no answers, so he did what he always did. He went to his cabin, took out his writing materials, and began to record everything he'd seen and heard. The speeches, the horn, the voting, Euron's coronation, all of it written down in careful detail, preserved for some future reader who might want to understand how the Iron Islands had chosen their own doom. Outside his cabin, the sea rolled on, grey and endless and utterly indifferent to the small dramas of men. And somewhere ahead, Pyke waited, and with it, whatever changes Euron Crow's eye would bring to House Greyjoy and the islands it ruled. Wendell wrote until his hand cramped and his candle burned low. Then he sealed the pages, hid them away, and lay on his narrow bunk, listening to the ship creak and the waves slap against the hull. Tomorrow they would reach Pyke. Tomorrow would begin whatever came next. But tonight he simply lay in the darkness, and wondered if he should have spoken, should have tried to warn them, should have done something other than watch and record and bear silent witness to choices he knew were wrong. The sea gave no answer. It never did. Pyke felt different when they returned. The castle had always been cold and damp, but now it carried an additional weight, a sense of menace that had not been there before. Euron's ships filled the harbour, strange vessels from distant ports crewed by men who looked like they had sailed through nightmares. The castle servants moved more quietly, spoke in whispers, avoided eye contact. Even the drowned priests seemed uneasy, though they hid it behind their usual fanaticism. Wendell returned to his chambers to find them exactly as he had left them, untouched and undisturbed. For a moment he allowed himself to believe that perhaps nothing would change, that Euron would be content to rule from the sea-stone chair and leave the day-to-day functioning of the castle to those who knew it best. Then he heard the screaming from the courtyard below. He went to his window and looked down. Euron's men were dragging someone across the stones, a captain Wendell recognized as one of Victarion's supporters. The man was pleading, trying to explain, but his words were cut short as they threw him to his knees before a block of wood. One of Euron's crew raised an axe. The blade fell. Blood sprayed across the courtyard stones. Wendell turned away, his stomach churning. This was how it would begin then. purges, consolidation of power, the elimination of anyone who might pose a threat, or simply anyone Euron found inconvenient. He had read enough history to know the pattern. New rulers, especially those who took power through unconventional means, always needed to prove themselves through blood. They needed to show they were strong, that dissent would not be tolerated, that the old order was dead, and a new one had begun. Over the following days, Wendell watched Pyke transform. Euron moved through the castle like a dark wind, changing things seemingly at random, disrupting the old patterns just to prove he could. He dismissed servants who'd served House Greyjoy for decades, replacing them with his own men. He opened the treasury and distributed gold freely to his supporters, buying loyalty with Balon's carefully hoarded wealth. He held feasts in the great hall that lasted until dawn, where men drank and boasted and swore oaths to their new king while musicians played strange songs from distant lands. Wendell tried to keep to his routines. He tended the rookery, maintained the ravens, answered the messages that still came from across the Iron Islands and the mainland. The world beyond Pyke was changing too. News arrived in fragments, carried by birds and ships and travelling merchants. Winterfell had fallen. Not to Theon. Theon was dead or captured. The reports were unclear. But to Ramsay Bolton, the bastard of the Dreadfort, who had pretended to help the Ironborn only to betray them. The castle had been burned, its people scattered or killed. The North's vengeance was terrible and complete. Wendell read these reports and thought about Theon, the young man who had tried so hard to be Ironborn and had died for it. He had been abandoned by his father, ignored by his sister, betrayed by his allies, and destroyed by his own desperate need to prove himself. It was a tragedy, senseless and complete, and Wendell wondered if anyone would remember him as anything other than a cautionary tale about ambition and identity. Yara had survived Winterfell's fall, barely. She had pulled back to the coast with her remaining ships, retreating to Deepwood Motter, where she could defend her position with the sea at her back. But she was isolated now, cut off from Pyke, commanding a fragment of the fleet in a hostile land with winter coming on. Wendell suspected she would not last long. The North was vast and angry, and even the best Ironborn captain could not hold territory so far from the sea. One night, a week after the Kingsmoot, Euron summoned Wendell to his chambers. The Maester climbed the winding stairs to what had been Balon's private rooms, now transformed into something stranger and more disturbing. The walls were hung with trophies from Euron's travels, strange masks, unusual weapons, bottles filled with things that might have been preserved organs, or possibly something worse. Books lay open on tables, texts in languages Wendell did not recognize, illustrated with diagrams that made his eyes hurt to look at them. Euron sat in a chair by the window, looking out at the dark sea, a cup of wine in his hand. He did not turn when Wendell entered, did not acknowledge his presence for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was casual, almost friendly. "Tell me, Maester, what do you think of me?" It was a trap, obviously. Any answer Wendell gave could be used against him. Praise would sound false. Criticism would be dangerous. So he chose carefully. "I think you are a man who gets what he wants, my lord. The Kingsmoot proved that." Euron laughed, a sound without real humour. "Diplomacy? How boring. I ask you what you think, and you tell me what I've done. Let me be more specific. Do you think I'm mad?" Wendell hesitated. I think you are unconventional, my lord. Still diplomatic, still careful. Euron finally turned to look at him, and his one visible eye was amused. I've read your records, Maester. Did you know that? While you were at the Kingsmoot, I had men search your chambers. They found your official accounts, very proper and neutral. But they also found your hidden journal, the one where you write what you really think. Wendell felt his blood turn cold. His secret compartment had been discovered. His private thoughts, his suspicions about Balon's death, his criticisms of Ironborn culture, all of it had been read by the man who now ruled the Iron Islands with absolute power. Fascinating reading, Euron continued. So much judgment hidden beneath such careful prose. You think we're barbarians, don't you? You think our customs are savage, our faith is madness, our way of life is doomed to fail. And yet you serve us anyway, sending our ravens, tending our sick, keeping our records. Why? Because I swore an oath, Wendell said quietly. Masters serve without judgment, without taking sides. We provide knowledge and healing to whoever needs it, regardless of whether we approve of their choices. Noble, Euron said, and completely dishonest. You judge us constantly. You just don't act on those judgments because you're afraid, or because you're smart enough to know that speaking truth to power gets you killed. He stood and moved closer, studying Wendell like a curiosity. I could have you killed for what you wrote about my brother's death. Your suspicions were uncomfortably close to accurate, but I won't. Do you know why? No, my lord. Because you're useful. Because a master who actually knows his craft is valuable, even if he despises the people he serves. And because I find your internal conflict amusing. You hate us, but you help us. You disapprove, but you obey. You're trapped by your own principles, and it makes you suffer. I enjoy watching people suffer in interesting ways. He returned to his chair and his wine, dismissing Wendell with a wave. Keep your journals if you like. Write whatever you want. Just remember that I know what you really think, and I'm allowing you to continue thinking it. Don't mistake that permission for safety. Wendell left the chamber with shaking hands and returned to his own rooms. He sat at his desk for a long time, staring at the place where he had hidden his journal, the hiding place that had proved worthless. Everything he had written, every private thought and suspicion, had been read and judged by a man who found suffering amusing. He should stop writing. He should destroy the journal, burn every page, eliminate the evidence of his true thoughts. But even as he considered it, he knew he would not. The journal was all he had, the only way he could maintain any sense of integrity in a place where integrity seemed meaningless. If he stopped recording the truth, even in secret, he would lose the last part of himself that mattered. So he opened a fresh page and began to write. He wrote about the execution in the courtyard, about the changes sweeping through Pyke, about his conversation with Euron. He wrote knowing it might be read, knowing it might be used against him, but writing anyway, because it was what Maesters did. They bore witness. They recorded truth, even when truth was dangerous. The weeks that followed were dark ones. Euron launched new raids, more ambitious and brutal than anything Balon had attempted. He sent ships to the Reach, to the Riverlands, to anywhere he thought might be vulnerable. Some succeeded, bringing back plunder and slaves. Others failed spectacularly, the ships and their crews simply disappearing, never to return. Euron seemed unconcerned either way. He was playing a larger game, one that Wendell could not fully understand, but that clearly involved more than simple reaving. Brother Norbert came to Wendell's chamber less frequently now. The old Septon was afraid, and with good reason. Euron had no tolerance for the faith of the Seven, viewing it as weakness imported from the Green Lands. Several of the servants who had prayed with Brother Norbert had been caught and punished, not killed, but humiliated and hurt enough to make the point. The Septon's secret shrine had been discovered and destroyed, his holy texts burned, his altar stones thrown into the sea. "I am too old to start over," Brother Norbert told Wendell one night, his voice trembling. "I have served here for 30 years. This is my home, but I do not recognize it any more. The darkness has always been here, but now it rules openly, without shame or restraint." "Will you leave?" Wendell asked. The old man shook his head. "Where would I go? No, I will stay. I will continue my work as I can, quietly, carefully. As you do, Maester. We are both trapped by our vows, are we not? You serve whoever rules. I serve the Seven wherever they send me. Neither of us is free to choose." They sat together in silence, two old men in a castle that was becoming stranger and more dangerous with each passing day. Finally, Brother Norbert rose to leave. At the door, he paused. "Thank you for your kindness, Maester, for treating my ailments, for listening when I needed to speak. When things get worse, I am glad to know there is at least one decent man still on this cursed rock." After he left, Wendell received a letter from the Citadel. It was brief and formal, offering him the opportunity to request reassignment. His term at Pyke had been difficult, the letter acknowledged. If he wished to serve elsewhere, arrangements could be made. Another master would be sent to replace him. Wendell held the letter for a long time, reading it again and again, feeling the weight of the choice it represented. He could leave. He could abandon Pyke and its madness, return to Old Town, or request posting to some pleasant castle in the Reach, where lords valued learning and healing. No one would blame him. He had served faithfully under impossible conditions. He had earned the right to escape. But if he left, who would tend to the servants who came to him in secret for healing? Who would maintain the ravens and ensure messages were sent accurately? Who would keep the records, tell the truth about what was happening here, bear witness to history, even when that history was dark and terrible? He thought about his oath. Maesters served. That was the core of it, the foundation on which everything else was built. They served without judgment, without choosing sides, without fleeing when service became difficult. They were meant to be constants in a changing world, providers of knowledge and healing, regardless of who ruled or what policies they implemented. But he also thought about Brother Norbert's words. "We are both trapped by our vows." Was it truly service if you had no choice? Was it truly noble to continue helping people whose values you despised and whose actions you knew were wrong? Or was it simply cowardice, hiding behind oaths and duty to avoid making harder choices? Wendell lit a candle and sat at his desk. He took out a fresh sheet of parchment and began composing his response to the Citadel. As he wrote, he realized he had already made his decision. Perhaps had made it weeks ago. Perhaps had made it the moment he first arrived at Pyke and saw the damp archives and neglected ravens. He would stay. He would stay because the servants needed him, because Brother Norbert needed him, because someone had to maintain the records and tell the truth about what was happening. He would stay, because leaving would be admitting that some places were beyond help, some people beyond service, and he was not ready to make that admission. He would stay, because it was what Maesters did, even when staying meant complicity, even when staying meant suffering. He finished the letter and sealed it. In the morning, he would send it with a raven, declining the Citadel's offer, committing himself to Pyke for however long Euron Greyjoy ruled, or until something changed. It was not a heroic choice. It was not even necessarily a good choice. But it was his choice, made freely despite all the constraints, and he would live with the consequences. Wendell closed his journal and prepared for bed. Outside his window, the sea roared its eternal song, indifferent to human decisions and human suffering. Tomorrow would bring more ravens, more news from a world tearing itself apart in war and winter. Tomorrow would bring more small cruelties and large tragedies, more evidence that the Iron Islands were rushing toward disaster with Euron at the helm. But tomorrow he would still be here. He would still tend his birds and treat his patients and write his records. He would still bear witness to history, even when history was dark. He would still serve, even when service felt meaningless. Because that was what Maesters did. That was what he had sworn to do. And in a world where oaths were broken as easily as bones, where honor seemed increasingly like a luxury only fools could afford, perhaps keeping faith with a vow was itself a kind of resistance. Wendell blew out his candle and lay in the darkness, listening to the castle settle around him, and the sea whisper outside his window. He was a maester on Pyke, serving the Crow's Eye, bearing witness to madness, and he would endure. It was not much, but it was something. And sometimes, in dark times, something was all you had.